All right. Hey, welcome everybody. If I can ask you to find a seat, we're going to get rolling. We've got an awesome program tonight, and there's a lot of content, so I want to make sure we get through it in a reasonable amount of time. For those of you who I don't know, my name is Luke Melia. I'm the organizer of Ember.js NYC. Excited to be back together. We took December off, and so I'm stoked to see so many of you out for the beginning of an awesome 2014 for both this meetup and for Ember in general and for JavaScript in general too. So a few announcements. First, kind of some meetup logistics. I want to thank, as always, our sponsors, Pivotal Labs, whose offices we are in and has been graciously hosting us for over a year, providing us with food and drink and incredible AV facilities and stuff. Pivotal's an awesome agile consultancy. So whether you are in the market for a team to help you build, help your startup or larger organization build a new product, or whether you're an engineer that's looking to join a great consultancy, Pivotal should definitely be near the top of your list to check out. Our other sponsor is Yap Labs, which is my company, and we are a combination product team and EmberJS consulting and training organization. So if you are interested in any of those things, feel free to talk to me anytime. So we are here in January. We've got a great lineup this evening. Just to give you a sense of the agenda, we're going to do two remote segments focused around education. And so one of the things that that you may or may not know is that at the end of August of 2013, Ember went 1.0. And with that, we adopted semantic versioning, which meant that the API settled down. And for those of you who were using Ember before that, that was a big change because the API went through a lot of evolution and churn to really get things right before we got to that kind of magical 1.0 spot. The thing that's great about having a stable API is that training and education can catch up with the framework, and we're really starting to see that happen in a big way now. So the first two segments we're going to look at, we're going to have tonight are around the educational space in the Ember ecosystem, and I think you'll enjoy both of those. We're then going to have Stefan Penner do an introduction to the Ember Inspector, which is an awesome extension that works with Chrome and Firefox to help with Ember development. If you haven't seen that, you're in for a treat. Yes. Thank you. I was just telling them that you were going to give a talk. And then Alex is going to give us an update on the next stage of the Ember view layer, which is going by the code name HTMLBars, and give us an update on where development is at with that. That's Alex Machnier, who's on the Ember core team and is here tonight. We're then going to go into our main talks, and we've got three. The first is about the run loop from Brendan Briggs. So if you've if ever wondered what is this mystical run loop at the heart of Ember, you'll find out tonight. Then Sarah Robinson is with us from San Francisco to share the Ember bindings to Firebase, which lets you do some pretty awesome stuff. And then we're going to close out the night with Matthew Beal doing a talk about the container. And the container is one of these other things that's really at the heart of Ember and makes it work. You don't necessarily encounter it directly in your first foray into Ember, but as you get deeper, it's something that's really valuable to know well. And hopefully we'll know it well by the end of the evening. After that, we'll go for drinks for those of you who still have some energy. So I'll announce where that is then. So that's the agenda for tonight. Coming up next week is the next installment of our Hacker Hours. Hacker Hours, unlike this meetup, this segment that we do every month, is a smaller, more intimate group. It's about really mentoring and being mentored on Ember. And Kevin Korneman, raise your hand, Kevin, is the organizer of Hacker Hours. So feel free to talk to him if you have questions about what it's like, or if you have ideas about what you would like it to be like. But that is now up in the meetup. We charge a very small amount. It's $1 to RSVP just to keep the numbers down. Yes? Right. And so the way that hacker hours work best is if there's a nice balance of mentors and people who are getting started or have questions. So if you know that you're in that mentor category, please come. Andre. Totally. As Andre said, if you have code problems that you're working on, bring the code. This is the kind of event where you will sit down with somebody, look at code together, figure out how to improve it and fix things. So that's going to be the next one is next Tuesday. Meetup is the RSVPs are on the meetup. We've also, thanks to Stephen at Pivotal, scheduled the next 2 segments of this meetup, which are going to be on February 27th and March 27th. I'm looking for speakers for those events, so if you've got something you'd like to share, talk to me. A few other quick things to go over. EmberConf is the first major Ember conference in North America. And it's happening March 25th and 26th in Portland, Oregon. There are still some tickets available. And Tilda is doing some training the day before, along with Dockyard, that's doing a training day as well that day. So I will definitely be there, and I hope to see many of you as well. I'm guessing it will be taped. I don't know. I don't know that for sure, but. Other stuff that's been going on since we've last got together is we've had Ember is now at 1.31, so you should check the EmberJS.com blog for updates. Those of you who have apps that are at 1.0 release or later, we've found that upgrading has been pretty easy. Unlike previous upgrades before 1.0. So I definitely encourage people to stay up to date, not the least of which because the most recent update was a security fix for an XSS issue, cross-site scripting vulnerability. The last thing I want to show before we get into the main content, anybody use Vine on your phone? Raise your hand. Yep, a few folks. So Vine recently launched their web experience, which is similar conceptually to the phone experience. You kind of scroll through and videos start playing. This is all in Ember. So Janessa Det, who is the lead over at Vine, has been to a number of Ember NYC events, recently launched this along with her team, and it's really well done. It's simple, but it's elegant and gets the job done. So awesome to see another high-profile site launched in Ember. With that, we're going to try to go remote to Florida for our first segment. Let's see if we can pull it off. Adam Fortuna, are you there?
Hey.
All right. Let's see. Do we have audio here? I'm going to try to mic you with my mic. Let's see if that works. Can you give me a testing 1, 2?
Testing 1, 2. Testing 1, 2.
No, Jay. Okay. Cool. So we're going to give this a shot. So Adam Fortuna, who are you and why do we call you from the Ember NYC meetup?
Hey, is everyone able to see me?
Say yes, everybody.
Cool. So me and a couple other people in CodeSchool have been using Ember for quite a while. Some people long back before it was Ember. And we had been wanting to do an Ember course at CodeSchool for quite a while. And so in December, we finally launched it. And we finished it up with a couple more levels just a couple weeks ago.
Awesome. So when CodeSchool, for those of us who don't know what it is, can you give what's the quick overview?
It's a way to learn code, usually in the browser. So if you've ever been to Try Ruby or Rails for Zombies, those are CodeSchool courses where you usually watch a video and then do some challenges in the browser.
Awesome. Cool. So is it possible for you to show us a little bit about what this course looks like, feels like?
Yeah, let me share my screen real quick.
Great.
Let's see. Are you able to see that?
Looks like it's about to switch over.
Cool.
Yep, there we go.
Cool. So yeah, the course is available over at CodeSchool. You click over to it. Right now, it is 7 levels, kind of going from the ground up on it. So it's kind of targeting people with like no experience with Ember, who are just getting into it. Because it shows you how to create an Ember application from scratch, how routes fit into the big picture, nested routes, and working with dynamic segments. And then we touch a little bit on Ember data, using either the fixture adapter or REST, and then kind of finishing up with some more advanced controller stuff, computed properties, and then getting into render and Ember components and partial organization for templates and things like that.
Cool, looks great. What does one of these chapters look like, or what do we call them? Do you call them levels?
Yeah, levels. We've actually had some back and forth, but levels is kind of more gamified for it. So yeah, in the course you kind of start a level, get to watch a video of Greg Pollock demoing Ember, and then start on the challenges.
Cool. These are some pretty awesome illustrations, man.
Yeah, we worked with Dave Mottram and Justin Mazel. We contracted out some of the graphics for this course because we really wanted to add a lot of visual impact to it.
Sweet. So it looks like you've got a built-in kind of editor, and then people are writing code, and then you guys are the course tells you if you're correct or not. Is that how it works?
Yeah. So this one, and at any time you can rewatch the video or show the answer. So for this one, we're just wanting to create a basic Ember app, and as I type it in, it shows that it's successful, and then I can preview it and see the little app I built.
Cool.
And yeah, so as you solve more of them, more of these become checked off, and eventually you get into something more complex where you're building out this entire application, and you've written every one of these lines of code by 5-6 levels in.
Nice. So you're covering getting data and the hooks in the router and outlets and all that kind of stuff.
We don't cover outlets. We do cover nested routes, and then most of the data in our case is from fixtures.
Okay.
And then
Gotcha.
Some of the relationships in Ember model or in Ember data.
Cool. Cool. This looks awesome. So how do people, if people want to check this out, how do they find it?
So it's available on the CodeSchool website under courses. That first level that I was showing you has 3 videos in it, and those are all free. The first level's free. So if you ever wanted to kind of see if it's a style of learning that you'd enjoy, you can try it out without having to pay anything.
Great. Well, this is
After
awesome.
that,
I'm really excited to see you guys covering Ember. It looks like it's a great kind of self-paced learning experience for folks. Now, when we were, you and your colleague Corey and I were talking, he was able to magically send me via email T-shirts. I don't know how that worked exactly, but we have some pretty awesome T-shirts here. Yeah. So what we're going to do is over the course of the evening, we're going to ask some trivia questions. And if you come up with the right answer, one of these can be yours. And I also have discount cards for this course, which I'll also include in the trivia opportunity. So thank you for sending this stuff up. Thanks for putting the course together. And Adam, do you want to ask the first trivia question? Okay. You have something you can come up with?
about if I was wanting to clean up a property in a controller that that defines trying to do something without being too hard here. That defines that just returns the length, and we want it to update every time the length changes. We might use something within Ember computed. What might that be?
Thoughts? Tom? Alias, is that the answer you're looking for? All right, well done, sir. The winner of the first CodeSchool t-shirt and 1 month free CodeSchool membership. Congratulations. Hey, Adam, thank you for taking some time out of your Thursday night and joining us in New York. Have fun down there in Florida. Please enjoy the warmth for us because we could certainly use some up here.
It's going to get 30 degrees tonight.
All right, we'll talk to you real soon, man. Thanks again.
Thanks a lot.
Ciao.
Have a good one.
So everybody say bye. Woo! All right. Salud. We are going to flip around and see if we can get out to Portland, Oregon. This one is a little dicier because I didn't get recent confirmation. If not, we'll try to get to him later in the evening. We'll see. All right. Steph, why don't you come up and start getting set up while we see if Senor Tom Dale... Oh, all right. Looks like Tom Dale isn't available. All right, we'll rectify this later in the evening. Cool. Steph, come on up and let's take a look at Ember Inspector. While Steph is getting plugged in, we're going to our second trivia question. And I want to say thank you to the folks who contributed quick trivia questions to my crowdsourced trivia effort here. Let's see what we have. Okay. This question was from Michael Madrid. Michael, that means you're not eligible to answer. The question is, can you explicitly set a computed property? Andre Milan? Yes. Would you care to elaborate?
As long as you define it, you can define the hook to do the deserialization of your property specific.
Okay, so if you're going to explicitly set a computer property, you can define the function for the computer property with 2 arguments, where the second argument is becomes the value that you're setting. If you don't have 2 arguments, you know what happens? If you don't have 2 arguments, you basically squash the computed property and replace it with the value that you're setting. It no longer is a computed property then. But you got the crux of the question right, and you win the t-shirt and the 1 month membership. Folks, I don't know, you may want to try to move to this row. I'm not sure what's going on. Have him call, well, you can call you since you're hooked up. Oh, this is a good question.
You guys notice how terrible Google Hangouts is for like actually coordinating calls? Once you're connected, it kind of works, but I mean, like it says he's calling me, but yet I still can't actually get to the call that he's calling me. I have to call him. Get 2 calls over at the same time, the same person. Like right now.
I'm gonna try miking it the same way. Tom Dale.
Hey, can you guys hear me?
Where is this?
Oh, what's going on, guys? Oh my God. Oh, it's so hot here. Oh, Jesus, I'm like melting. It's so hot here. West Coast.
It is-
Wait, is that
There's-
New York? Oh, hold on. Sorry, I better level up. You guys are pretty cold. Okay. Hold on, I got gloves. I got ready for New York. I knew I would be coming, so I want to get my gloves ready. Okay, I got a beanie too. All right, this is good.
Don't overheat.
All right, now I'm ready to talk New York.
So,
How-
Tom, thanks for being
Sorry, go
thanks
ahead.
for being one of us. We appreciate you
Oh,
taking the
thank you for
time.
having me.
So we've got a big room full of Ember developers here in New York, and I was telling everybody that since the API has settled down, the community has really been able to rally around educational material and training.
You mean they put the pitchforks down?
I think they did. People have put the pitchforks down, appreciating the ability to upgrade their apps in a few hours instead of a week. Or months. So
Control it strong with this one.
So I wanted to ask if you would share the recent training stuff that you guys have been working on.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, so I'm actually really, really excited about this because for the first time, I think it's an opportunity for Yehud and I to make available some content about like how we think about the framework and kind of the core concepts that we think drive a lot of the API behind how routing works and how templates work, etc. So if you guys want to check it out, it's actually pretty cool. I have to say, as an open source maintainer, if anyone in the audience, I can't actually see you, so I don't know who's actually there. But if there are any open source maintainers in the audience, I can't recommend highly enough doing training about your software because it is the most humbling thing that you will ever do. There's nothing more humbling than watching someone fail while using your software. That's a great experience that everyone should have. I'll put up a link. If you guys want to visit tilde.io/training, you can get a link to our online training. So just click on the link. It's actually 3 days of, it was recorded. We did a training session in Chicago where we sat down with the attendees, and our friends at Gaslight came and they recorded the whole thing and they edited it. And we took all of the content that you use in the course and we put it up along with the videos. So you can follow along with the videos at home. It's half the price of what a normal in-person 3-day training would be. And it's actually pretty cool because you build an app. For the whole training, you start from basically zero, and you build up an app across the 3 days. So it's very interactive, and at the end, you have a real sense of an accomplishment. So if you're new to Ember in particular, I'd say it's a really great way to really, really understand the concepts, at least as Yehud and I think about them anyway. And the other thing I'll just mention is that hopefully everyone's coming to EmberConf. If you haven't bought a ticket, please buy one before they sell out because they're about to sell out very soon. And if you're interested in doing, if there are any advanced users in the audience, we have got a one-day advanced training course that's it's actually pretty cool. It's called basically it's called advanced persistence, but it's it's roll your own Ember data essentially. We'll have you write a library called microdata, and you'll basically learn about all of the concepts that you would need to really understand what goes into something like Ember data or any of the other Ember persistence frameworks. So yeah, so that's the pitch.
Awesome,
Thank you, Luke.
and that's the day before EmberConf, is that right?
That's correct. Yeah, the day before EmberConf.
Awesome.
So if you're here, Portland's going to be beautiful. I mean, it should be beautiful. I can't actually guarantee anything about the weather, but it should be beautiful. And if it sucks, there's really great beer nonetheless.
Good stuff. Cool. Well, thank you so much for spending a little time with us. Thanks for putting the trainings together, both the in-person stuff and the online self-paced one. And we're looking forward to seeing you in Portland in a couple months.
I can't wait. I'm so excited.
Awesome. Cool. Thanks, Tom. Everybody say
Cool.
bye.
Thank you, Luke. Thank you, guys. Bye.
All right. Cool. So with that, we're going to turn it over to Stefan Penner. Steph, for those of you who don't know, is a colleague of mine at Yap and is a member of the EmberJS core team. If you have ever opened issues or participated in issues on GitHub, it's very likely that you've interacted with Steph because he is an absolute machine on dealing with those issues and helping folks out. Without further ado, Stefan Penner on Ember Inspector.
Can you hear me? All right. So that's RDO. It's nothing to do with anything important. All right. So this will be a quick talk. Who here has built an Ember app before? That's awesome. So like a year ago, asking the same question here, I think it would have been significantly less. And the second question is, who here has tried to build an Ember app and failed because they couldn't figure out where anything was? That would have been the majority, and so it's good. But even though I think we've done a good job at improving where stuff is, how to find stuff, how to debug, we still really don't want to expose everything to the whole world, but rather we would much rather give you good tools to sort of visually inspect your application and get an idea of what's going on, how to debug, and you want to do so in a way where you don't have to know all the internal APIs. So the good solution for this is an extension or a browser extension. As a community, mostly by an individual called Teddy Zini, we have an Ember Inspector, which is a Chrome and Firefox extension that lets you debug your Ember app. So there's two ways to install it. One way is to go to the Chrome or Firefox add-on or extension stores and install it via there. But since we're all developers, I'm just going to grab it from the development repository. So I'll show you guys how to do that so that you can contribute when you find an itch that needs to be scratched. Because it turns out if you're an Ember developer, you can develop the extension because the extension is actually just 2 Ember apps in iframes that run just a little bit of out of context, but it's nice. All right, just a sec. All right, so first of all, the extension lives at tilde.io Ember extension. So to get started, you should just probably do a git checkout. And since I have already done that, it lives, that's not important where it lives. So there's a, I should probably have figured out how to hook this thing up properly. So there's a ability to load unpacked extensions. So these are basically extensions that you can load from your file system rather than the signed ones from the Chrome store. You have to enable that via Chrome://options or something. Anyway, so once you have that, you basically want to load the unpacked extension. So I'm going to traverse over to the Ember extension repository, dist Chrome. In order to build this Chrome, you have to run grunt in the project. Hit this, done, boom, we have Ember Inspector 1.0. Now, this is not an Ember app, this is an Ember app. Is this too small? Should I make it bigger? It's good? All right. So the first thing you'll need to do is just reload the Chrome DevTools. Reload the page. And boom. We have a tree of your Ember views. So as I mouse over these guys here, I'm able to see the individual views. In addition, sometimes you're like, well, that view there, I want to see the context or the thing that's driving the data on it. And that can be a little bit tedious, but here it's actually really simple. You just click on the thing you want, and to the right, you get a little properties tool. So you can actually go in and make changes as you want. Where it gets really cool is actually, let's grab one of these models here. If you click an Ember data model or other thing that implements that API, you can actually make changes here live which affect your application, which is useful, but let's face it, sometimes you just want to interact with the entity itself. There's a thing in the top right-hand corner of basically everything in this properties panel, this little thing that doesn't look like a link, but I assure you it is in fact a link. If you click on this, it'll actually send that thing that you have found to the console, give you a quick preview, and now $E is available to you. And you can mutate or play with this as needed. Yeah, I think so. The power of the web. So that's pretty useful. But there's more than just views in our application. Turns out we actually have route hierarchies as well. And sometimes it's kind of confusing what Ember has done for you, or you just want to get a handle on this thing that's deeply nested in your Ember app, and rather than trying to do some crazy dance to find it, use the inspector. You can basically click on anything. Again, you get the thing on the right. You can send it to the console. You can view various properties and modify them. Yeah, so that's pretty neat. There's also an Ember data version, which unfortunately doesn't quite work with a moduled Ember application yet. A few of us are working on a project to get that in order. But I assure you it's the same, except it shows all of your Ember data models. You can update them, remove them, all that fun stuff. And here's a fun one, and it's promises. So who here has built an application and something went wrong with the promise? So the dude you need to blame is sitting in the corner over there. And apparently he's never had this problem because he didn't put up his hand. So for the rest of us mortals, sometimes it's nice to know what's actually going on. What does it look? So in an application, you have like your network stack that shows you all the requests that happen. What if you had the exact same thing for promises? And that's exactly what the promise tab does. It's an early implementation. It works relatively well. We're probably going to see a lot of improvement here. But basically, it keeps track of all the promises that have happened in your system, tells you their current status, so this one has fulfilled. We also label all of our promises meticulously inside of Ember, so they hopefully provide good context. And again, just like the rest of the inspector, if you see something and you want to interact with it, you can click the fulfillment or rejection value, and boom, you get it available right here. And just to sort of show that live, I'm going to make a promise. And as you can see, it looks like there's a bug here. Anyway, so we can see the two promises that occurred here, and it looks like our helpful error messages have actually prevented this from turning into an error, which is unfortunate. But if in fact you click the trace here, you can actually get the trace of where the promise did its thing. Anyway, so that's the Ember extension. Feel free to hack on it. Feel free to try it. It's been super valuable. Even someone that knows all the internal APIs is often more practical just to open the inspector and click the relevant pane, click the thing, and then edit it in the console. Anyways, that's it.
Awesome. I have a question for you, Steph. You know, you said it's okay to hack on. You could hack on it. What languages or frameworks you need to know to hack on the Ember Inspector?
Ember.
It's written in Ember.
It's written in Ember. It's two iframes that it's basically three iframes you need to think about. The one that your app is in, which is the main context, and then two where the tooling lives. They communicate to each other, but they're basically just Ember apps. They have a full Ember testing test suite. So when the test suite runs, it simulates a user clicking and moving, and it's very hackable. So cool. I suggest you give it a try.
Good stuff. All right, thanks everybody. Thanks Steph. Alex, you want to come up? Well, Alex McNear is coming and getting hooked up. Let's go to the trivia well. This is relevant to the something that Steph just showed. The question is, what is the name of the library that powers Ember promises? Or what does Jonathan Goldman never do for this meetup? In the back? RSVP is the answer. And you are the next winner of a CodeSchool t-shirt and 1 month free membership to CodeSchool. Congratulations, sir. Cool. Take a minute to throw that over your ear if you can get it to work. Let's see. There you go. Testing.
Hello.
Sounds good. For those I mentioned before, Alex McNear is a great guy.
Thank you.
And in truth, he's a little eccentric, which is great. And he's also exceptionally talented with Photoshop.
There's an example in this presentation.
You will see an example apparently. And Alex is also, he's AKA Mr. Router for all of his amazing work on the Ember router. And he's a member of the Ember core team. So if you have questions about the guts of the router, this is the man to pin down at the bar.
Yeah, I think you've spent that quota. That's 3 times, 3 little jabs tonight about the Ember router. All right. Hey, everyone. My name's Alex. I'm here to talk about a thing called HTMLBars, and it's probably the thing I'm most excited about of Ember things that'll happen in 2014. So quick show of hands who's heard of HTMLBars? Who knows what it is and why it's cool? Okay, sort of a decent amount. Okay, so anyway, quick little background. Handlebars.js is a templating language that Ember kind of specifies as a dependency. It's got the thing, it looks like the logicless templating language mustache, so a bunch of curly braces to indicate where all the dynamic content is. And we've been doing pretty well with a sort of Emberized version of Handlebars in the last 2 years or whatever it is, to sort of overlay it with some Ember-y stuff to make kind of data binding work, because just kind of vanilla Handlebars just kind of outputs some text, and none of the values are going to update when the underlying data changes. So that's strictly Handlebars with a little bit of an Ember layer on top of it. HTMLBars is another layer sort of on top of that. It actually replaces some sort of portions, the sort of JavaScript compiler portion of Handlebars, which basically takes your templates and makes them HTML aware. And what that generally means is that you could have a curly brace, double curly brace area in your template, which means take some dynamic content and insert this into here, and if it changes, then update it. And there's been sort of a limitation, which is that since Handlebars is just only aware of text, it takes, you define your template as text, and it outputs text, and then it calls inner HTML on an element to basically turn that, to have the browser parse it. And unfortunately, it means that there's no, Handlebars as a templating language or compiler doesn't know where this sort of dynamic content is happening. It doesn't know if it's in the middle of an element's content or within a tag or with an attribute in the tag. And that sort of leads to some kind of weird syntax that you have to do to sort of get around it. So you'll see what I mean in just one moment. But in general, why is HTMLBars an exciting thing? So like I said, context-specific helpers and bindings. You would like to be able to write something like this on the top, which is to say it's like you have a class which when foo changes, that'll update the class to whatever the current value of foo is. Whenever bar changes, that'll update. This is the one that works just fine. This is the one that you can't really do in Ember. You've got to do this awkward bind adder class equals foo. And well, this part's the same, but this is just one of the weird things one of the sort of starting gotchas with Ember, and the whole reason behind it is that Handlebars doesn't know where this little double curly dynamic content is. It just sees this all as text. So HTMLBars is basically infuses it with the ability to know where all these helpers are taking place, and it turns out that that's a really powerful thing to be able to take advantage of and do just an astounding number of really awesome things that I think we're still discovering at the moment. So basically, you will be able to do something like this, which, you know, big deal. This isn't really why this isn't all that exciting. It'll make things a little bit easier, but whatever. You can remember to do the bind adder thing that I was talking about. So this is sort of another example of something you can do, because HTMLBars is going to know, it's basically going to distinguish it between these 3 forms. One is it's a mustache that takes place just right in the tag, one that takes place inside an attribute, and one that is, you know, like what it does today, which is just in the sort of element's content. So because HTMLBars is able to distinguish between that, your helpers you don't have to write helpers in a different way. You don't have to use a different special syntax. You can use this class equals foo the way that you expect. So that's just a sort of syntax-only benefit of what this is going to be able to do for you. And for what's worth, HTMLBars is still under development. I'll talk about when we might expect it to sort of reach something that you can mess around with sometime toward the end. So another benefit is that HTMLBars, rather than building up strings and concatenating a bunch of strings and finally giving... Still working? Good. While Handlebars is basically string only, HTMLBars in the process of sort of building and rendering a template. No? Sorry. One more time. So handlebars builds up strings, concatenates them together, and gives you this final output. HTMLBars is in the process of rendering your template, going to build up this sort of mini DOM fragment. And it does that only one time, and then every time that needs to render to the screen, it just does a very efficient, deep clone of that. And basically every one of the helpers and every one of these little dynamic regions has access to exactly that element where it needs to update, which means whereas you have to, if you actually inspected your DOM when there's a lot of dynamic content in your Ember app, you see a bunch of these metamorph looking things, which are just sort of like placeholders in your DOM to know where sort of are the. Hello. Okay. So there's this thing called metamorphs, which is the present day hack to sort of get the dynamic stuff to work in HTML, or sorry, in Ember. And fortunately, with HTML bars, you're going to be able to take something that looks like this, and eventually it's going to look just like this. There's only the DOM elements that you actually wrote in your template, and none of this extra crap that has to be sort of injected in there to handle all the data binding. So that's going to be a nice thing. It's less clutter to look at when you're diving into the DOM inspector. So another, I mean, one of the best things about this is that because we're getting rid of all this string concatenation stuff, we're getting rid of a lot of just horrible use of memory, and particularly just invoking the garbage collector many times in the course of rendering a huge list or any other sort of complicated view. So just in the, I get a little example at the end of this, which I wouldn't be surprised if anyone who's following sort of Eric Brin's Twitter feed, you might probably have seen this before. But basically everything so far seems very promising as far as all the amazing performance gains that are going to come of this. You know, React has become pretty popular as like the thing lately that came from Facebook that's doing things very efficiently, and we're actually in talks with a lot of the React guys who would love for Ember to use them as their view layer, because they consider Ember the thing that's sort of solved the application structure problem, but they think they've sort of nailed the most efficient way to render views and components and stuff. And I mean, we're basically, it's the sort of collaboration between the two parties has been great. We're also finding there's plenty of sort of benchmarks that we've been able to produce just with the code that's been written for HTML bars so far that's just yielded even better performance than what React is able to do. I mean, I'm sure it varies from case to case depending on the test case, but it doesn't really look like we're going to be needing sort of React's help, which I think is amazing because no one's really denied Ember's sort of power, but I think anyone trying to do something that involves many elements in a list has sort of run against this sort of performance wall, and you've always had to do something, maybe use list view or any of these other plugins to get around it, and it's just, once HTMLBars is in there, it's just going to be insane performance gains, so hopefully you will never even need to think about these things anymore. So another sort of benefit of this, and this actually is speaking a little bit more toward the what you can do to further optimize things, is that HTMLBars and everything that kind of goes into its integration with Ember comes in a bunch of different layers. There's HTMLBars, which is the thing that makes helpers and all these bindings sort of context aware to know where they're happening in the DOM. Then on top of that is a separate library called bound templates, which sort of overlays this streams abstraction. And then on top of that is the sort of Ember integration, which is like, how do we make this, I don't know, update every time some property on a controller or a view changes. And depending on what problem you're trying to solve, some performance-related problem, you're basically going to have these primitives to go down to whichever level of abstraction you want. It's kind of like, I mean, I sort of think of it in the way that in Rails you can, if you don't want to go all the way through the Rails stack to some Rails controller, you can define some middleware that's strictly on like the rack level to do whatever quick performance-sensitive thing you need to do if you don't really need to rely on all the other stuff that Rails brings you. And you've been sort of able to do this in Ember. You can sort of write these raw helpers which do very little and might not update the way you expect or whatever, but it's not as nice of a sort of layered API that you can go down to whichever level of extraction that you want as we would have liked to have. And HTMLBars is really going to be able to give you all of that. So yeah, that's pretty much what I just said. It already gives you many performance gains for free, but you can drop down to the level of optimization that you want. Okay, a quick word on a new thing in handlebars syntax, and I think I just totally gave away a trivia question. Whoops. So recently, actually spurred on by the rewrite of the query params API, which everyone should check out at some point. It's only on Canary at this point, but we're hoping it'll make the next round into beta. We sort of needed a concept of a sub-helper that could sort of scope all the arguments and not have it like bleed into the link to helper. And it turned out that there was sort of this ace up Yehuda's sleeve about something that he had in the back of his head, didn't really want to bring it to handlebars to begin with because the potential for abuse is maybe possibly high, but turns out it is a useful thing to have. And so there's a thing that looks very familiar to Lisp, if anyone's ever written in that, called an S expression, and it's basically this sort of deal here, which is unlike the sort of method name, parentheses, arguments, or whatever, it's everything in the parentheses is going to be like a sub-helper invocation. This is the sort of uninteresting, neutered form of it. I mean, it's cool. I mean, it solves a problem. You can do query params, and you'll know that sort equals ASC is a query param that you're setting, and it's separate from any of the other helper stuff that you could do in link to. But it's going to be definitely very fully realized in HTMLBars land. You'll be able to have these composable helpers rather than having to, if you had some kind of formatting that you needed to do, and it's only in one place, and you didn't want to have to just open a new file and create a new helper just to reverse something and then capitalize it, you could actually just write it into the template. Capitalize, reverse foo, and these two things at the bottom would actually generate the same thing. How does it work? This streams abstraction brought in by one of the layers of this whole HTMLBars project called bound templates. And of course, like I said, you could totally just abuse this thing and just go completely crazy. So don't. Rule of thumb. And I mean, obviously, if something gets crazy enough, you can just sort of refactor that and turn it into a helper. So many things. I could probably put another word in about some of the impact that. Some of the impact that this is going to have on the components land of things. But I guess we can talk about it if we're doing the traditional post Ember meetup bar thing. Okay. I would not be surprised if many of you have already seen this, but this is some of the, this is Eric's JS Fiddle comparing Backbone, HTMLBars, React, and just sort of raw JavaScript animation. And this is absolutely. I mean, as everyone here who has ever written an Ember app before, there's this use case that everyone has to do where they have to spinning circles have traditionally been very difficult in the JavaScript MVC lands, and now it's great. I mean, we've solved the problem, and there's really nothing else that needs to be solved. So this is Backbone. This is actually something that Jeremy Ashkenazi, I think, wrote when Ember sort of first came out, comparing and contrasting performance between Backbone and HTMLBars. Sorry, Backbone and Ember. And this was sort of on the assumption that if you're going to make this animation work, I think he wrote it in a sort of idiomatic Ember way, which is rather than calling whatever jQuery animator explicitly updating each thing for every frame, it was just using bindings, and he was just trying to show how slow Ember could be or whatever. This is actually going unfairly slow. I don't know what's going on with my computer. I hope this doesn't completely botch this demonstration. Let's just try it again. So that was Backbone. This is HTMLBars. Look at those fast spinning things. This is React, just a tiny little bit slower. And this is just going back to HTMLBars and going to nothing. It's the slightest bit faster. So, I mean, this is all very early, and I'm sure there's something about this example which, I mean, basically Eric and Chris in particular are doing a good job of, like, as we layer more Ember idioms on top of it, we're keeping track of where things are getting slowed down the most to sort of preserve that, like I said, ability to go down to whichever layer of abstraction that you want to optimize. So anyway, things are looking wonderful on this front, and there are many things to be excited about. Quick thing, someone mentioned my Photoshop talents. This was a lazy one. This is everyone that's been working on HTMLBars all combined into one. So there's a little bit of Yehuda, Chris Selden, Eric Bryn, and me. And anyway, that's it. Any questions about HTMLBars, other things? Yes? In the back. Question was, current Ember templates, will they be backwards compatible? And yes, they will be. I'm sure there'll be some trickery that we might have to do, but we're going to make it work. Yeah, they might be too fast. The spinning circles just might be a blur. Yeah, we'll make sure the tooling is definitely there.
That question was, will there be a compiler similar to there is for handlebars? You can pre-compile your templates.
Yeah.
Brendan?
Hello. You had said earlier you were going to let us know when it was going to be playable, so that was my only question.
I don't know 100%. I think it is. To keep your attention going. So I think it is not a completely unreasonable estimate, particularly just since it would be such a momentous occasion for us to get it largely, if not completely done, maybe by EmberConf. That would be awesome, and I think we would be very motivated to hit that deadline. But I don't want to speak and underestimate it because it's quite a substantial refactoring of the view layer and many other things. And there are still some questions up in the air of whether we want to go this way or that way. But in the end, everyone's gonna win. It's just I don't want to. Before or after Ember data? I don't know. Isn't Ember data done?
We are targeting the 1.x branch. This is not going to be Ember 2.0.
This is not going to be Ember 2.0. So we really are going to, I'm pretty sure we're going to nail everything about backwards compatibility. So I would not worry about that.
Cool. Awesome. Thank you, Alex.
One more question in the back. The question, will we be able to use HTMLBars in Backbone? I would like, and I think there's some support from the other people working on this thing, to play around with the idea of having a sort of micro library, just view layer only component of this thing. That'll, I mean, it'd be great for, I don't know, the publicity of it. You know, we release this one thing that everyone can use, and you get it for free in Ember. So I don't know what the final decision is going to be on that, but it would be totally feasible, and I'd hope we do it. That's my opinion. Steph thinks yes.
Awesome. Thanks, guys. All right. Brendan, why don't you come up and get set up while we go to another trivia question? Okay. This one is, who can explain the difference between an Ember view and an Ember component? Any takers? Difference between an Ember view and an Ember component. No, I just want to hear a coherent sentence or two explaining the difference, and that's going to be good enough for a victory. Let's go to Casey in the back. I'm going to run the mic over, Casey. 1 sec.
Okay, so I'll give it my best shot. A component is a reusable collection of code. So for example, you might say, have like a view that you use to render user profiles that you might reuse around your site, whereas a view is just like I guess a generic output for data from your controller and your model. Would that work?
I think that's pretty good. The other gentleman who had his hand up a few rows ahead, was your answer similar or different to that one?
The main difference between that and a view would be very or no coupling to your application or any application.
Good point. So very, very isolated. All right, I'm going to go with two. We're going to award 2 prizes for that question. To both folks, we've got, and that looks like the last 2 T-shirts. And 1 month, we have some more 1 month of CodeSchools left, so we'll keep going with the trivia over the evening as we go. So I'm excited to introduce next my friend Brendan Briggs. Brendan is a developer over down in the financial district at Capital IQ. And he and I have been working together some recently. And Brendan, can you pass that back to the gentleman behind you? Cool. and I've been really impressed with Brendan's grasp of Ember and they're not just as a kind of application developer, but really getting into the internals and understanding what's going on under the hood. And so I asked him if he was interested in sharing tonight. Can I plug you in here?
Oh.
And he graciously accepted.
The most important thing.
So with that, I'm excited to learn about the run loop from Brendan Briggs.
So, can everyone hear me? Is it working? Not at all? Wonderful.
Try to get it close to your mouth.
Okay. This seems to kind of work. Yes. Everyone can hear me? I'll just keep my finger on my face the entire time.
You prefer to use this one?
Sure. I can use 2 hands. I think, yes. Okay, great. So, I'm glad that everyone could make it out in this very brisk night to come learn about Ember things. And I'm very pleased to be able to talk to you guys about something that gave me a very painful time when I was originally learning, called the Ember Run Loop. Now, people have heard many things, dark whispers in the night, things that keep them up all night. And I'm here to dispel all those myths and convince you that learning the run loop is actually a pretty okay thing. So, continuing, who am I to speak of these things? Well, as the wonderful Luke stole my wonderful introduction, I am a developer at S&P Capital IQ. It's a financial information data company, and we have a lot of people tonight also with me. So they're over here, and if you would like to talk to us about perhaps the many projects we're working on with Ember, please feel free to reach out afterwards. I've been working with Ember for about a year now, back when it was in pre-4, and it has been a wild ride, very fun. And I am a person who likes tabs over spaces. So this does not affect my presentation. I will not be telling you all sorts of crazy things and trying to convert you, at least not tonight. But, yes, sorry, man. I know, there's another Brendan here, and I'm glad he's here. That's all I want to say. Okay, so, continuing. How many people would say they're super knowledgeable at the run loop? They could probably roll their own thing. By raise of hands. Luke? Wonderful. How about people who are pretty experienced, like they've played around with it, they've delved into the internals? Awesome. Most people. And how about people who have no idea what it is? So I must be hallucinating the rest of you guys, because I didn't see all the hands, but okay. Yes. So the wonderful thing about this presentation is, even if you happen to have a momentary lapse of consciousness and ignore everything I say, this will most likely not stop you from being able to develop awesome Ember applications, which is a great thing, because as I was mentioning earlier, when I first started out, I was having trouble grasping the run loop. And at the same time, I could still develop the application and push it forward. But as time progressed, this slowly became a more urgent thing to address, as I will explain later. Oh, sorry. I am modulating too much with my hands because I am hearing music and I like to dance. And, well, the wonderful thing is that if you actually end up listening to it and understanding what I'm saying, which is my aim, then when you look at a stack trace, for example, inside your Ember code debugging something, you'll be like, I understand this. I no longer have to ignore half the stack trace. That's pretty awesome. So, as I was saying, I've had a journey through understanding the run loop, and I would like to share this with you. So, when I first started, is this big enough? Yes, you can see my Comic Sans. I was at the point where I heard of this thing about EmberJS, and it was really awesome, and it helped you build scalable, ambitious Ember applications. And one of the cool things about it was the fact that it had this thing called the run loop. And when I first heard about it, I was like, what is this? And then I quickly did a Google search, and I found this awesome post by someone called Alex Matchner. He might or might not be here, called Everything You Never Really Want to Learn About the Ember Run Loop. I spent like 20 minutes trying to memorize that. But I read it about 3 or 4 times, and afterwards, I was confident that I still didn't understand anything about the run loop. So that was really helpful. However, as I explained, you can still continue developing Ember applications, and I continued to do so. So I was pretty happy at that point. I was making cool stuff, making lots of circle spin. And I came to this point of running into an Ember bug during my wonderful testing. And what happened, I cannot exactly remember. However, I came to the idea that perhaps I should look into this run loop thing a little bit more. And I came to the conclusion that, as the name might suggest, there is running and looping involved. As it turns out, this is not the case. There is not a constantly running loop that processes actions. There is something that processes actions. It's just not constantly running because, let's say I'm on a browser and I'm having some JavaScript code that's always running. That sounds like a wonderful way to block input, doesn't it? Yeah. So after this point, I read Alex's wonderful article, armed with more Ember knowledge, and I could understand about 80% of it. And I was like, yes, this is cool. The run loop has queues, and they have names, and rendering is happening somewhere in between. So as you can see with my wonderful diagram, there is a series of queues, and there is an execution order. So certain actions, I realized, would be put on one queue, and certain actions would be put on other queues, which seemed to make a lot of sense. And for that point, I was pretty satisfied. And phone orientation lock would be a wonderful thing on the Windows Phone. Just saying. So after this point, I ended up running into more bugs, and I saw the wonderful stack trace, which I fearfully ignored half of because I saw this scary thing called backburner set timeout and backburner end, and I clicked things and there was anonymous functions, and I cried a lot. So I was like, I'm gonna be a man, and I am gonna read the source code because that's what cool people do. And turns out, source code is about 741 lines and is very readable. It took me about an hour or two to really grasp what's going on. And I would suggest if anyone wants to increase their knowledge and they raise their hand at my last question, that they would also clone the repo and then read more. So, great news for you guys. You do not have to go through the trials and tribulations that I had to go through because you have me. So you will get to the point of, assuming that you haven't read the source code, you'll get to the point where you can read the source code. So please read the source code because it's awesome. And it'll make you smile. So I'm going to have to put down the remote for a second and show you guys an example of a problem that I could not figure out in the beginning because I had no idea what the run loop was. So as you can imagine, it involves circles. And what was happening was I decided to make a simple app that, as you can see, is this large enough? I assume, no? Okay, 1 second. Haha, can you see? Yes? Cool. So there is a simple template that will render a bunch of views depending on a Boolean, the start render, and start render is set true at a random interval in the future. And after that, all these circles get rendered, and the number of circles is a random number. So what was happening was I wanted to order these circles around the outline of a circle, which is pretty cool. However, as you can see, there's one circle, which is changing a lot of colors. This is not actually the case. There's a bunch of circles on top of each other. So basically, my code arranged circles, refused to really outline itself. And if we want to know why, we can do the inspector. Yes, it worked. And set debugger. Cool. This is very small. Even I know. Okay. And as we can see, we're inside the arrange circles function. So thank goodness that actually ran. And if we look to see what this is, there is nothing. Now, I swear all those circles had a class called circle on it because that just makes sense. However, why are these circles not there? And if so, how can we fix this? Can anyone answer this question? Those circles are views that are rendered in each helper. Maybe they haven't been rendered yet. That makes a lot of sense. But why haven't they been rendered yet, Luke? That makes sense. So, knowing this, is there a way that we could fix this? As you can see, arrange circles gets called on this start render observer, and that start render triggers the rendering of those circles. You know? Yes. Oh, timeout? Yes, run it later. That makes sense. How about run next? Let's see. How about rune next? Lo and behold, run next saves the day again. If you guys haven't heard of run next, I will talk lots about it. Don't worry. So, this is all good and fancy. However, we can do something even better and use Ember Run Schedule. Yes. Aha. And because there's more circles, it must be better. It's not because it's random at all. So, what is this run schedule after render? I assume some of you will know, and I assume some of you won't know. But a simple explanation for now is that, as the gentleman so rightly suggests, perhaps we should defer the action of this arranged circles to the future. And this is deferring it to the future in a queue called after render. So, seeing this and seeing my wonderful circles, let's go back to the presentation. I guess I should. I should leave it. Aha. Okay. So, knowing all this and seeing this example, I've written up a brief description of what the run loop actually is in terms of Ember. So, the run loop is a programming construct that allows the batching and deferring of actions to run in a way that is most efficient. The specific implementation that Ember uses exists as a micro-library called Backburner.js. If that makes a bunch of sense to you, then we'll continue. And that's all good and fine knowing the concept. It kind of makes sense, I guess. It's just a series of skipped queues as my previous picture showed. But the question is, how does this run loop actually get processed? And when does it start and when does it end? So the idea is, on the start of a run loop, which is triggered by things getting scheduled onto that queue, it starts at the initial queue, which happens in Ember's case to be the sync queue, and then clears out all the actions after taking a snapshot of those actions. And then once that's done, it scans the queue, looks for the earliest queue with pending actions onto it, because perhaps actions have been added inside that code, and then decides to flush that queue as well. So this continues until there is no more actions in the queue, and that's when the run loop ends. Simple enough algorithm, right? Makes sense. So, by the course of actually rearranging the way we execute things, we can make clever optimizations. And and this is one of them. So in other frameworks, such as Backbone, an awesome framework, by the way, we can have the added benefit of whenever we change a bounded property, we can render the DOM again. That sounds really cool. If we can do it 1,000 times, we can render the DOM 1,000 times. Who wouldn't want that, except the user, maybe? But unfortunately, the run loop will only render that change once, assuming that we go from a variable back and forth and back and forth, which seems like a reasonable thing to do if you have many actions running at the same time. Why is this happening? Well, this is happening because when you are setting that bound property, these actions are occurring on a queue, which is so rightly named actions. And the rendering of that bound property happens on a different queue. So if we go from A to B to C to A, when we hit the render queue, we realize that we have nothing to render because what changed? So doing that, we can see that we open up ourselves a class of lots of optimizations to apply. And thankfully, since you guys don't really have to work really internally with the run loop, Ember developers can just bump the version, and then your code runs faster, and then your boss is really happy. Yes. Okay. So this is all good and well. As I previously mentioned, Ember is using a micro library called Backburner.js, which actually started out in the Ember library and then was pulled out by Eric Brin. However, what is happening currently is when you are running the Ember source code, it creates an instance of Backburner and then creates 6 queues in it. Now these queues are, as you can see, sync, actions, router transitions, render, after render, and destroy. The first two, sync and actions, I would like to kind of explain since they're not as clear. Sync is responsible for propagating changes in bindings. So something that should generally happen before anything else. And actions is the default queue. So every time you run an Ember Run or any other actions happening, it'll most likely end up in the actions queue. There's a lot of things that happen up in the action queue. Now the last 4 are pretty descriptive based on their name. However, I'd like to pull your attention to after render queue, which has the added benefit of being there just for you guys to actually use. Because for some reason, it's useful to be able to work with things that have been rendered. I don't know, maybe with circles. So, how does this magically work? And how do things get onto the run queue? Well, the simple explanation is that things don't always get run onto the run loop. And for the most part, if you work inside the Ember code, if you try and make like a pretty pragmatic Ember application, things will mostly get run over. However, there are lots of cases where this might not happen and your code gets run outside the run loop. This can happen when you set up click events, for example, or really any kind of callback that gets executed on the global context. So what happens when Ember realizes that you're trying to run an Ember method and there's no run loop to put it into? Well, it so cleverly decides not to crash and create a run loop for you and then runs the code inside it, which mostly makes sense. However, this sometimes will give you bad performance. So, as I was explaining, if you have multiple actions that are happening outside the Ember run loop, it will create an auto run for you. And unfortunately, if we have way too many auto runs, the browser GC can start kicking in between those things because it's not synchronously executed. And then what happens is that we get to see the wonderful thing known as UI lag, which should be minimized, assuming you love your user, which you should since you're all front-end developers. So the way we fix this is not really difficult. All we need to do is wrap the code in a run loop, as we wanted to actually do in the first place. So this is as simple as using an Ember Run, or maybe using something called Ember Run Bind that I'll explain next. So this is all good. We understand what the run loop is. We understand how it's executing actions, and we understand things to avoid. However, how do we actually use it? How do we actually interact with it? As we saw before, there is this wonderful method called Ember Run Next. And it really solves all your problems with the run loop if you ever encounter anything. If you check Stack Overflow, this is definitely the thing you must use. And I would definitely recommend never using it, because I was joking. So I've listed a bunch of methods that you can use. And if you go into the source code, generally they're like 3 lines or less. It's really easy to understand them. But in case you don't want to read the source codes, I will explain them to you. So starting off, there's Ember Run Schedule, which, as you can imagine, schedules things onto the run loop. What you need to provide is the name of the queue that you want to schedule it onto, the context, and then the function. So as you saw in my example, I ended up using Ember Run Schedule after render, and then provided my this.arrange circles. And what happened was, it scheduled arrange circles on the after render queue. Kind of makes sense. So then there's schedule once, which, as the name might suggest, allows you to only really schedule the method that you pass onto the run loop once. And that's only on that current run loop. So of course, like if you have a run loop and you call it schedule once, and then you have another run loop and you call it schedule once, then it's going to run that method twice, which it should. Now there's Ember Run and Ember Run Once. What are these things? As I mentioned before, there is this actions queue, and that is the default queue. So what happens when you run these commands is that it's going to schedule onto the actions queue, which for the most part you can be pretty safe with, like if that's what you want to do, right? Now there is something called Ember Run Bind, which is super awesome and has been added recently by Stefan. So thank him for this. It allows you to basically wrap a function inside a run loop. So for example, if you want to have a click handler and then you pass it some function, instead of having ember.run and then your function inside and having 2 functions that kind of look kind of ugly, all you need to do is pass that function to Ember Run Bind. And then Bob's your uncle and Fanny's your aunt. So there's Ember Run Throttle, which, as you can imagine, allows you to execute this method every so often, given a period. And then there's Ember Run to Bounds, which is almost like schedule once, except for the fact that you want your code to execute once after waiting a certain period of time. So if you call your code thousands of times and your period is 200 milliseconds, it'll have to wait 200 milliseconds. So, of course, there's lots of more methods that I don't have the breadth to be able to say. And for that, there is this wonderful website called EmberJS.com, and it has guides, and it also has an API documentation. So I would definitely suggest you go there if you want to learn more methods to use in the Ember loop. So knowing the methods, knowing the concept, knowing the execution order, we're fully prepared to start looking at some source code. So in the first source code, in the first snippet of the source code, this happens to be from EmberJS inside the core object destroy method, which, as you can imagine, gets called when things that extend off the Ember object get destroyed. Now, the first 3 lines, or first 4 lines, don't really have to do with the run loop. As you can see, it is setting a flag. And then the last 2 actions are deferring 2 methods. The first one being will destroy, and the last one being schedule destroy onto different queues of the run loop. As we can see, the first one is scheduled onto the actions, and the second one's scheduled onto the destroy. Now, through this code, we can see that this provides us a nice bubble in order to actually execute actions in between these 2 things, even though we have 2 methods that are being called side by side. This is super helpful, and as you can see, will destroy is a callback that a user can provide to the object that can be run. And then more things can happen, rendering can happen, and this all is great because the thing we want to happen last really is the destroy. The second example is in Ember Data. As you can see, we're using a run once, and then calling this method called update record arrays. Now this function update record arrays later, as you can imagine, will be called multiple times. An example of that is in the setting of any of the records. So if you imagine you're looping through a whole bunch of records and you don't want it to be able to thrash your browser in terms of updating the record array each time you update it, you can use this. And then what happens is, after you set all the properties of the records, finally there will be an update record arrays call that will be run, which is very performant over calling it each time you set it, as you can imagine, because 1 is less than n when n is greater than 1. This will run on, as I said earlier, the actions queue. So, knowing what we know, we can look back at that example. And thankfully, I didn't close it. Yes, I didn't close it. Cool. So now we can understand why scheduling it onto after render is the better choice. So if we want to really understand this, we can even check to see what queue. Keyword shortcuts don't work anymore. Aha. We can see that, oh, JS Fiddle, you're so mean. Anyways, it really debugged. It just, for some reason, doesn't update that. So we can see that if we go through the call stack, we can see this deferred action queues flush, which is part of the algorithm that flushes the queue. We can see that the queue name we're on, or the queue that we're currently on, when this function was called is actions, yeah. So does a render queue happen after the actions or before? That is the question. Well, if anyone remembers, sorry to steal anyone's thunder, but as you might imagine, the render should and does happen after the actions. So what's happening is, as Luke previously mentioned, the circles aren't getting rendered yet. So this code shouldn't find any circles to arrange. So knowing this, we can schedule the arranged circles onto the after render queue so that this will execute when the circles are rendered. So hopefully this makes a lot of sense to you now. And as you can see, it was a kind of unknown problem that was easily solved in one line. So, just to make sure you guys understand the advantages of run and run once, I have made an example that should highlight my point. Now, if anyone still remembers statistics, that's great, because you can understand all these numbers. If anyone doesn't run, oh, I'm just going to update something to be more accurate in case someone calls me out. Speed should be higher if it's good, but in this case it's not. Yeah. I need to show that I remember math in university. I remember things, kind of. We can see that we are generating random samples for the exponential distribution. The useful thing about the exponential distribution is that given your e to the ex, your average will be the theta, and your variance will be 1 over theta squared, which is pretty useful in that since we set theta to 1, and that means our mean and our standard deviation should still be 1. So just making sure. These don't seem to be 1. I wonder why. The wonderful thing is that we've only generated 2 random samples from this exponential distribution. So we should probably add some more. And as you see, it's slowly converging to 1 for both. So as we can see, when I click these buttons, everything seems to be going very well. It seems to be quite performant. However, what happens if I add 3,000 at the same time? If I do the naive add, it takes 631 seconds. And if I continue, this will only grow more. However, as we can see, our mean and standard deviation are converging to 1, which is really good. So my math is correct. However, if we look at the code of naive add, naive add. What we're doing is we're setting a flag to tell my function to actually naive add, and then calling this. So what is happening is it's checking this flag. If it is, then it just calls this function directly. Else, if it's false, what's happening is that it's gonna pass this function to Ember Run once, and then however it works, update array stats, calculating the math and mean and standard deviation. That will update these figures. So as we can see, the number of times update array stats has run is 18,000 times. That's a lot of times. So each time we are generating each sample, since we're watching the length of the content, what's happening is this update array stats keeps on getting fired, which, as you can imagine, doesn't really need to be done until we finish adding everything. So if we use run once, that should work, right? So just making sure that we have a good time. 841 milliseconds, we can see that if we're using run once instead, what happens is taking half the time. So that seems pretty good. 3,000 is greater than 1. So hooray for executing less times. So in case everyone had their momentary lapse of consciousness, I'm just going to repeat the main points. The run loop is a very simple concept, which is just an ordered series of queues that has actions deferred onto it and then gets processed by backburner. So also important is that rendering will happen before the actions. So if you want to work with rendered elements, you should defer your things onto the after render queue and work with them. Another very, very important point. If the only thing you learn from this presentation is this, I will be happy. Ember Run Next is not the tool that you most likely need when you're solving these problems. If you do have a use case for Ember Run Next that these things cannot help with, please talk to me, because you're going to blow my mind. So please, please, please think before you use Run Next. It's just safe, and it protects you in the future. And also important, source code. Pretty cool thing. Helps you learn stuff. So there are some wonderful resources that I've linked if you want to learn more. There is, of course, the post that I had mentioned before that will definitely, even though the title says not, help you learn things about the run loop. There is this very cool visualization that I am just going to open up. I'm sorry, Alex, if you get mad at me for stealing this. And you can see that it actually plays through the queue and visualizes it. It's super cool. I thought about doing this, but he took a time machine, traveled back, and did it before me. So there is also Eric Brin's presentation, which really talks about how you can use Backburner outside of Ember and integrate it with other frameworks, such as Backbone, so we can make those optimizations that we're talking about, which is really, really cool. And of course, finally, there is the source code that I would once again ask you guys to read, because doing so will only improve things. So special thanks to Luke for convincing me to do this, because I was all like nervous and shy and, as you can tell, very freaked out about doing presentations. However, he was able to convince me and pull me over, and I'm very glad I did this. And thanks to Stefan for being there at 3 a.m. when I had really annoying questions to ask. And thanks to all you guys, because this is why I am here, and I am so happy that there exists such an awesome community that I can contribute to. Thank you.
All right, let's take one or two questions. And have run loop questions for Brendan.
Yes. Please tell me about Run Next and how you use it to solve the wonders of medicine. And
Raise your hand
else.
if you've used Ember Run Next in your app.
All you guys are liars.
What's the one place where you can use it?
When you want to log your user out by doing app reset, you need to escape the current run loop, and the run next that's probably the only real place where you want to use it ever.
Yay.
Cool. All right, good stuff. So while Sarah gets set up, we're going to take a quick stretch break. So get up, stretch it out. If you need to grab another beer or drink, do it, and then find your seat again. And while you're doing it, find somebody that you don't know here and say hello. All right, grab a seat. Here's the next trivia question for you. What is the difference? What is the difference between a volatile computed property and a regular computed property? Sir. Correct. The answer is that a volatile computed property is not cached. A free month of code school for you, sir. Thank you. Okay, so I'm excited to welcome both to the Ember meetup and to New York. In from San Francisco, Sarah Robinson, who works at Firebase and is going to show us what Firebase has been doing with Ember to make it easy to work with Firebase and Ember apps. So without further ado, Sarah Robinson.
Thanks, Luke. Can everyone hear? Cool. So I'm Sarah. I'm the community manager at Firebase, where I do developer outreach and marketing and a little bit of learning to program. I've been teaching myself to code for the past few months or so. So I'm going to tell you how you can build real-time apps using Firebase and Ember. So here's an overview of what I'm going to cover. First, I'm going to explain what Firebase is, how the API works. I'll show you 2 demos of Firebase that don't use Ember. And then I'm going to show you how Firebase can function as the backend for your Ember application. And I'll explain a library we wrote called EmberFire. And then I'll go through building a real-time chat application using EmberFire. And finally, I'll give you some resources that you can use to build your own real-time application using the 2 technologies. So just a quick show of hands, how many of you have heard of Firebase before? Okay, a lot of you have. So for those of you that don't know, what is Firebase? Firebase is an API that lets you store and sync your data in real time using just front-end code. So this means you just include the Firebase JavaScript library in your application. You can start sending data to our cloud database. It's a NoSQL JSON data store. And the really cool thing about Firebase is that everything updates in real time. So any clients that are connected to your application will see changes to the data as they happen in real time. They don't have to refresh the page. The second thing about Firebase is we have a lot of supporting services to help you build your app. One of them is called Firebase Simple Login. So one of the most common things you'll want to do when you build an app is authenticate users, have some sort of user login system. So with Simple Login, you just include another JavaScript library. And you can start authenticating users really easily using Facebook, Twitter, GitHub, Persona, or email password authentication. And then finally, if you're building a client-side only application, security becomes a top concern. So you're probably wondering, how do I secure my app? So we have a security API that lets you write declarative security rules, that lets you specify who has read and write access to your application at different nodes of the data. And the rules are expressed in a JSON-like format, similar to what you can see here. So now I'm going to show you 2 examples of how Firebase works. So what I have here is a basic HTML5 drawing application. It's less than 100 lines of code, just HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And I've included the Firebase JavaScript library here. So that gives you access to our cloud database. So what's going on here is the pixel data in this canvas, whenever it changes, it's being sent to the Firebase servers. And then any clients that are connected will see changes to the canvas in real time. So I'll show you a quick example here. These 2 tabs could be open anywhere in the world. They don't have to be on my computer here. If I draw on one, you'll see it reflected right away in the other, which is pretty cool. Same with this side. So another thing that Firebase takes care of for you is if you go offline or lose network connection, all of your changes will be synced locally. And then when you reconnect, they'll be sent to the server right away. So if I were to disconnect my Wi-Fi, make some changes on both canvases, when I reconnect, they'll be synced again. So that's just a quick drawing example. So Firebase is best for collaborative applications where data is changing frequently or when there's a lot of people editing the same piece of data at the same time. I'm going to show you one other example of Firebase without Ember. So what I have here is a multiplayer game of Tetris. Just going to pop it out in 2 tabs here. And again, this is just front-end code, just HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. It's a little longer than the drawing example. So what's going on here is instead of the pixel data being stored in Firebase, it's the application game state. And one thing we noticed early on when building Firebase is that developers have trouble debugging code, especially when you're working with a database. It's hard to visualize what's going on when the data is changing, if I'm adding data, deleting data, exactly what that looks like. So we built a tool called Forge, which I'll show you now. So this is a graphical debugger that shows you all of your data as it's changing in real time. So you'll see, like, as I move this piece here, the X and Y coordinates of the piece are changing. And one thing to know about Firebase is every piece of data can be referenced by a URL. So the URL right here, this is the URL of the root of my Firebase. If I just want to see the URL for the first player, I go to /player0. And it also works like a normal REST API. So if I append .json here, I get a JSON response back. And Forge is also an editor, so if I go in here and want to cheat and delete the board for the first player, or second player, it clears the board right away. So that's a quick overview of what Firebase is. Now I'll go back to the presentation. And so how does Ember fit in? So you're probably all familiar with this example. It's pretty basic. Basically, Ember makes it really easy to synchronize your model with the DOM. So the value of this input field will sync whenever you edit it. And so the way that Firebase works with Ember is, so Ember is very opinionated about the front end. Firebase is opinionated about the back end. So we found that they work really well together. Firebase can be the back end for your Ember application. You don't have to worry about managing servers or writing any back end code. So you can reference Ember directly from your Firebase app. But we wrote a library to make this easier. So it's called EmberFire. It's still pretty new, so we welcome your feedback. You're welcome to submit a pull request. So what EmberFire does is it makes it easier to integrate Firebase and Ember in your application, gets rid of some of the boilerplate code that you might have to write. So what can EmberFire do? So you can work with Firebase references in your application as if they were Ember objects. So the way that you write data to Firebase is you create a reference to the Firebase location that you specify. And all the references are URLs. So like the URL you saw in the Tetris example before, that was a Firebase reference. And it gives you 2 objects you can use. You can use EmberFire object, which we recommend for native values, and then EmberFire array, which is better for distributed ordered lists. So EmberFire array is really powerful. If you have a lot of people that are appending to the same list at the same time, this makes sure that, that they all get added to the list. So this uses Firebase's push function under the hood, which generates a unique ID every time a new piece of data is added. So using EmberFire, this is extending the simple example that I was showing you before. All of the data for your Ember models is synced in Firebase. So I'm going to quickly show you how this works using JSBin. So here's the model. I've created a demo Firebase. So if you append .demo to your Firebase URL, you can just create a Firebase on the fly and anyone can access it. It doesn't have any security rules. So if I change this here to say, hi Ember, you can see that it's persisted in Firebase. So that's pretty cool. Your Ember models are automatically synced with data that's stored in Firebase. And if you change it in either of the places, it'll be synced. So if I change this to say hello, it syncs automatically with my model. So either way, it works. So going back to the presentation. So I'm just going to quickly show you some code for building a real-time chat with EmberFire array. It's just a simple example. So what's going on here is we have a basic Ember template. We're iterating through messages, and then we're just displaying the name of the person that wrote the chat message and the message. And then we have 2 input boxes, one for your name, one for your message. And then when you send it, we want this to sync with Firebase and then also sync with your Ember model. So the way you do this is using Ember Fire Array. You create a Firebase reference, and then anytime somebody presses enter or submits the chat message, this data gets sent to Firebase, and then you clear the message field so that you can enter a new message. So it's a pretty simple application. I will quickly show you how it works. So right here, right now it's empty because there's no data. But if I enter my name, we can see, so this is the push function I was talking about before. It generates a unique ID every time something's added. So if multiple people are participating in the chat, all of the messages will be accounted for, and it's added to Firebase right there. So if this was live online, as many people could be editing, like adding to chat messages, and you would see them all right away in real time. So that's the basics of building a real-time chat app with Ember and Firebase. And go back here. Now I'm just going to share some resources you can use if you want to start developing your own app using the two technologies. So you're welcome to submit a pull request. And if you go to github.com/firebase/emberfire, you can check out our bindings there. You're also welcome to write your own wrapper for Ember and Firebase. A few people in the community have done that. And send us any feedback you have. So if you email support@Firebase, you can send us technical questions or feedback, anything that you have suggestions on for the bindings. Ember data support is coming soon. We've had a lot of requests for this. So we're working on that now, and it should be available within the next couple weeks. Another really cool feature that we just announced last week is Firebase hosting beta. So what this lets you do is you can deploy static applications, so your HTML, CSS, and JavaScript files, you can deploy them from the command line to your own firebaseapp.com domain. So you just have to install the Firebase command line tools. If you go to our documentation, you can see a page on Firebase hosting there. And then you can find us in Google Groups, Firebase Talk. We're pretty active there. If you have any questions or want to share any apps you've built with Firebase and Ember, you can share it on the Google group. And finally, we're Firebase on Twitter. So that's all I have.
Okay, that's pretty awesome stuff. Thank you so much for sharing it. Cool, so I want everybody to rally for one more awesome talk from Matthew Beal, who's going to get set up, and we're going to go with a couple of trivia questions while he's doing that. The next question I've got for you guys is, if you are working with a each helper or an array controller, and instead of just having simple data that you're working with in each iteration, you want to be able to wrap that data in a controller, what would you need to use to do that? Item controller was indeed the answer I was looking for. Well done, sir. Will you pass that back to him? Cool. I'll go with another one on topic for the presentation that you're about to see. In Ember, when you ask the container for something, it's going to consult another part of Ember to find out where to find that thing. What is that other part of Ember called? If you look up something on the container. Stefan? Oh, someone in the back, yes? The resolver is right, excellent. Question is, who wrote the resolver? Anybody? Okay, I wrote the resolver. Congratulations, 1 month of code school for you. Awesome, and I mentioned earlier, this is a more less technical, more ecosystem question. I mentioned earlier that EmberConf is the first real Ember conference in North America. What is the first conference worldwide called? Anybody? Matthew was a speaker at the first one. Emberfest, a free month of code school for you. Well done. Cool. I've got one of these left, and it's going to be for right after Matthew's talk. So rally for one more talk. Pay attention, and I'm really excited to have here. Do you want handheld or? Cool. I'm really excited to welcome back to EmberJS NYC a gentleman who's been involved in the community from very early on, a good friend of mine from many years back in the Ruby community, and someone who's just been contributing more and more to the Ember ecosystem, both through source code contributions, consulting for various companies around New York, and most recently writing one of the first Ember books that's hit the market. So with that, I'm excited to turn over the stage to Matthew Beal.
Cool. Seems like everyone gravitated over there, closer to the beer or something. Okay, so we're going to run through a couple things quick. I'm Matthew. This is some stuff. I work with this development partner, Corey, back there. We run a little shop called 201 Created, and we do a bunch of stuff with Ember. So if anyone wants people to work on Ember and help train teams, that's kind of the thing we do. And I just helped edit and author this book for Ember that came out in December. I was hoping that we would have the revised edition done for today, but it is not done for today. But it is coming. There's some great feedback from lots of people from over the holidays who read it. And I'm really happy with how the revisions came out and everything. And we're looking forward to having it out with improved formatting and all kinds of good things. But if you go to Ember NYC Edge at bit.ly, there's a $10 discount code, which makes it $10, which I hope it's worth $10 because it was a lot of time. Okay, so I think the container is kind of about what Ember is actually made of. So Ember's got like a bunch of things, right? It's this, sorry, this thing is a little bit awkward here. Okay, so Ember's an MVC framework. So that tells us that it has like a couple parts that talk to each other and interconnect. We have models, we have views, and we have controllers, and this is a great world. We also have some components and some routes and a router and some templates, so we've got a couple other things. And then usually once we bring in Ember data or some other data layer, we've got a couple more things. And we can think of these as just classes, but there are a lot of classes in Ember that you don't think about every day. These are the classes that you kind of actually have to like deal with. So they're kind of like first-class concepts in the language that you have to, or in the framework that you have to deal with. So there's a lot of them, and the container is going to help us figure out how to deal with these things. So I think a good place to start would be to compare what happens, what's different in between two things. So our router is obviously, it's going to be a route. There's only ever one. Right? We don't start up the app and have like two different routers for different spots or something like that. It's always an instance. It has a class, and then it becomes a thing. And it is found at app.router, and it has access to a store. So it's got like a bunch of properties that make it kind of a unique class of things. Templates have properties that make them unique. They present HTML. There's many of them. They're only functions. When you run handlebars, Ember handlebars compile, all you get back is a function that you can pass in data, and it will present that data as HTML. So they're just functions. You can't instantiate them. There's no object to deal with. So they're different. So that kind of helps identify what are the things that make these objects, like what are the things that they share that make them categories of types that we can point at as one thing. And the most obvious one is a shared interface. So if I have an index view, and I'm going to make another view, they're going to act the same way. But this would be crazy. So we have, actual classes that we can use. But at the end of the day, the thing that's important is that they share the same interface between them. That's what makes them a type of view that behaves a certain way. So usually a superclass, but just a shared interface. Another one would be shared dependencies. So when I'm on my index route and I want to get to the URL, I can call router URL, and the router is always going to be present when I'm on the route. I can always ask for the router. On any route that I have anywhere, there's always a property called router. So this is another thing that makes them different. A view doesn't have access to the router. Shared usage. So each of these things is used a little bit differently, right? If I have a component, it's going to be a class. If I have a template, again, it's only ever going to be a function. Sometimes we deal with them in an instantiated way, and sometimes we don't. We don't instantiate templates. All we do is just use the function, but we obviously instantiate components. And if we ask for a new one every time, components, every time I use a component, I'm saying I want a brand new thing, right? If I have a property on this component that is a list item, and I have a property on this component that's a list item, even if they're the same name, they don't share any data in between each other. They're little segmented things. Whereas if I have a controller and I use like needs or something else to pull it somewhere and I access that controller from somewhere else, it's pretty much always the same thing. If I have a car controller, it's always going to be talking about the same model and the same thing. And then the last one is shared discovery. And shared discovery is just how we actually dig these things up, right? So if I have a color picker component, the color picker is the actual name part. That's what I care about. So I want to pull that off and use it to find it. On the templates, there's a thing called Ember.templates that's available where you can throw all of your templates organized by name when name is just a string. And models just show up with like no suffix on them. And so these other parts of how you find them identify like the pattern that you use for looking up that item, for discovering that thing when you go hunting for it. So containers are going to help us organize all this stuff and help it make a lot more sense and then make it work in a nice consistent way. It's going to organize all these building blocks in one smooth manner. It's going to help us reorganize the building blocks. So if they don't do something that we really want them to be able to do, we can take them apart and put them back together in new ways. And they help us add new things. Sometimes the NVC pattern in your big data layer with all these features doesn't have the right abstraction for the problem that you're trying to solve. So sometimes we need to create new things that don't previously exist. So the first thing we're going to run through is registry and lookup. And this is the Ember container, how it solves some of these things. I have a worker pool here, and then I'm going to make a container, and the container is available as Ember.container. It's a pretty simple thing. Internally, it actually has no Ember. It could be pulled out of Ember maybe. It's just like a clean little pojo, as they say. And if we look it up, then you get an instance of the thing. So I'm going to register it and give it a name. And the name has a type, and then a colon, and then the name of the actual item that I want to put in there. And then I pass it in the class. And the class is, we're going to call it a factory from now on. We pass it in a factory. The factories are just things which usually generate instances. But in general, when we talk about the container, all the stuff in the container, those are all going to be called factories. So even if we had a template, it doesn't instantiate, we're still going to call it a factory. We go and look it up, and it's going to give you back the same instance every single time. So that's pretty good for a worker pool, because we always want the same thing. We call that a singleton. We can also put like things into a container. So we have a worker pool. I'm going to extend that and make a big pool that has a higher limit. And then I can take those and register them, and they share that first namespace of worker pool. And then I can look them up, and I'm going to get different instances of things because they have different names. And if I wanted, you could register for the worker pool main, big pool, and you would get back the main instance. And then if you ask for the big, you would get back the big instance. So what instance you get back is tied to the name. It's not of the thing in the container. It's not tied to the factory itself. Right, which is exactly what this is showing. So you go, if I passed big pool into the worker pool main, when I pull them out, I get an instance of big pool, but I still get a different instance because the name is what's deciding what the singleton is, what the thing is I get over and over again. We can register non-singleton factories. So if I had a worker, my workers, I don't want to have just one worker. I want to be able to generate lots of workers, as many as I want. So to the options in register, I pass an argument of singleton false, saying I don't want you to give me the same thing every time, and then every time we look it up, it'll give us back a fresh instance that we can do brand new work with. If I have non-classes, so if I have things that don't actually instantiate at all, like templates in Ember, or in this case, a logger, then you can just pass those and say instantiate false, and the container will just give you back the factory without making modifications to it. So it'll say, okay, you had a window.alert, that's just a function, instantiate false. When you go to look up logger alerts, just take that factory and give it right back to you immediately. Don't try and call create on it. Don't try and turn it into a real object. The extra hoops of lines like 5 through 7 have to do with console.log, which you can't just pass around like a function, unfortunately. Okay. Pretty solid. I'm going to keep you guys moving at a good clip, I hope, unless you all know this already. Injection and dependency lookup. So now we have a bunch of things that are in our container, right? Well, one of the features of the container is supposed to be dependency injection in ways that you can make dependencies work. So we're going to look at two different ways to do this. This first one is I have a worker pool, and I've registered my worker pool, and I can go ahead and look them up and pull out. This is what we saw before. But now we have a brand new dependency in this code. We have a logger, right? So whenever we submit the job, I want to call the logger and call begin job. So how does worker pool know what the logger is? So using our definition from before from window alert, I'm going to register on line 12 here a logger for alert, and I just pass in window alert, and I say instantiate false, so it's not going to try and turn it into an object. And then I can call container.injection. And what container injection is going to do is take the label worker pool main and say whatever thing in the container has a label of worker pool main, whenever someone looks it up, I want you to give it a property called logger, and I want you to put the factory from logger:alert into that position. So now our logger on worker pool, as soon as we create the instance, as soon as we look it up, we'll have that property of logger, which is pretty nice. And the big thing, well, one of the things to note here, the difference in between the two ways we're going to do this, is the control over the dependency is outside of the class. So the worker pool has no control over what the logger is. It doesn't know, it just presumes that there is a logger and that it behaves a certain way, but it has no actual control over what kind of logger it's going to get. And we can extend this to do dependencies on a type. So we had those labels before, worker pool :main and worker pool :big. Well, we wouldn't want to have to inject onto every single one of those. So because we have types now, we have a container that understands what type of thing you have. I can say I want to inject onto worker pool on line 17, and that says all worker pools of any kind that are a subcolon of what I am. I want to inject a property logger, and I want the logger to be the factory from logger:alert. And again, we'll get that logger, and we can go ahead and begin the job. And that's just a diagram that shows it's, yeah, looking at both of them, same as before. And the control is still outside. Cool. So we have one other dependency that was also in here. It's in the comments, so it was hard to find. But we're going to take a job and run it, and we want to add the workers if needed. So in our worker pool, someone's going to give us a job, and we're going to say, I have a max of 3 workers in my pool. Someone just gave me a new job. Do I have any workers? I have 0 workers. Okay, make a new one. We'll do that 3 times, then we'll hit some limits, and then we'll have to stop. But we're just going to focus right now on, I need a new worker, so where do I get that worker? So in this case, we're going to get what looks a little bit more complex, but is really not that scary. On line 10, we're going to look at if there's no worker available. So if there's no worker available to work on this thing, then I'm going to need to get a new one. And I'm going to call this .container.lookup. Now, this container lookup is available to me because this worker pool itself came from a container. So the container will put a property called container on anything that is looked up from inside of it. So you always have access to the other things that are inside of your container from inside of an object that's been looked up on it. And the really important thing here is that we've moved the control. So before, the control over the dependency was outside of worker pool. And for this one, the control over what kind of worker to fetch is going to be inside of the worker pool itself, which means we can do things like on line 8 now, we're going to look at job is async and decide if we want to get a worker :async or a worker :sync. So really, there's no one answer about which side is better to have the control on. This is about what kind of problem you need to solve. Do you need to be able to decide, like, at runtime? I mean, everything's at runtime, but do you need to be able to decide on the fly inside of that class what kind of dependency you need to pull in? Or is this a dependency that you can specify ahead of time and just leave all over the place and be fine with? So that's register and inject. And the big thing, again, is about the control, about where you're deciding who's going to be in control of things. So resolving factories is kind of the last thing. And we're not going to go too deep into this because there's a lot of awesome things that are going to happen and are happening and lots of people talking about it. So on line 11, we're adding a property called resolve, and we're adding a function. And what we're going to do now is we're going to say, I don't want to have to register everything by hand. In Ember, you just go ahead and say app.index controller. You don't need to then say, okay, now find a container and inject it onto something. Ember just knows how to find it. So we can make our own ad hoc containers know how to do this stuff as well. We're going to say resolve, and we're going to take the name, whatever the name is, and the name just gets passed in as a raw string in this case. And we're going to split it, and we're going to capitalize the parts, and we're going to look on myscope. And that allows us to find on line 6 the myscope.sync worker. And this is like, roughly similar to what's happening inside of Ember if you ask for a controller of some kind. And the really nice thing about this, and the thing that is really great if you're using Ember AppKit Rails or Ember AppKit or any of these other things that deal with modules and let you use modules with Ember, is that this resolver can change, and this resolver can now go ahead and pull in a module instead, which allows us to have a private namespace and all the great things that we get from having a strong module system. But we're not going to go down that rabbit hole because it is a totally awesome rabbit hole, but we're going to talk about how to put together your apps instead. So, the Ember container that we just talked about was a nice little container that you could use for things. Usually in Ember, you're using the application container, which is the thing that orchestrates all the different things already going on in the Ember app and allows you to deal with them. So there's only one, unless you go ahead and make one on your own, but there's always going to be like one container that you're dealing with that has everything inside of it. And there are a couple different ways that you can get to this. So maybe the best one is what we mentioned earlier, that everything that comes out of the container already has the container on it. Because Ember uses the container for all these different types, you usually have a this.container where you can actually find things. So in this case, I'm on an index view and I want to be able to find the router. So I'm just going to look at this container lookup. Router:main is how I find the thing that is router in the main one, and that gives me a property for it. And note that there's no dependency there's no dependency keys for this property. It doesn't need to say it's dependent on container or anything, because container is going to be there when it starts up, and it's never ever going to change. It's just going to be the same thing all the time. So another really useful one is app register and app inject. There's an API that kind of wraps the container proper in Ember and gives you some convenience functions. So app register and app inject are kind of just convenient ways to be able to access the container itself when you're not inside of an object. Initializers are a bit of a more formal way to do this, and kind of my preferred way to do this. So if you define an initializer, this initializer will get run as your app boots up, and it gets a container and an application. Then you can do all kinds of things. You can use the application API and call application register or application inject, or you can use, I'm sorry, that should read container.injection. Or you could use the container and use the API that's actually on the container and do some more powerful things. It's kind of up to you at that point. And then the other big way is needs. Needs is just a form of dependency injection. If you say you need something called analytics on the index controller, it's going to find the other controller with that name and inject it onto the controller's property. So then you can access controllers.analytics and be able to grab your analytics engine. So this is kind of a very lightweight way to do things. If you don't want to worry about initializers or the container or anything else, you can just say, oh, I just needs this thing, and Ember will look for another controller that has that name and then make it available to you. And there's one more. There's a question on Twitter.
Well, the person who asked the question to me on Twitter should ask him.
Yes. Yes. Component 2. Yes.
Wouldn't that break? Would you be able to reach outside the component?
So again, kind of like we talked about before with like Alex was talking about with S expressions, like there are lots of evil things that you can do. Like you could change all controllers on your application through the container to be non-singletons. Like it would suck. It would be really weird. So yes, you could totally just break the scope. But there are other ways that you could break the scope. You could define globals in JavaScript and just break the scope. So yeah, I think it is useful in some cases though, and we're gonna go through those. There are a couple spots out in Ember itself that kind of fudge the line a little bit. So there's one more unsafe way, and I shouldn't leave this slide up too long, but there's an app__container, and app__container is good if you're debugging. You can use it on the console and be able to pull up the container and pull out any controller in your entire application and interact with it and set and get things on it, which is really cool. You can also sometimes be using it in tests where you start up a version of an app for some kind of acceptance test, and then you're like, oh, I need the container because I want to find a controller and set some value on it to test a certain state that I'm in. Those are like the edge cases when it kind of makes sense to use, but the underscores are there to remind you that you really, really should not be using it for any of your actual application code. So it should certainly never be anything that's like part of your app that you're using day to day. Use this .container or some other like properly scoped thing. Through app_container. I think it depends on what kind of test you're doing. We're going to run through some tests in a bit that use a container, but it definitely depends on what kind of test. Acceptance tests, maybe. Unit tests, I would hope not. As long as you're looking up a controller. Needs only looks up controllers. That's the only limitation of it. So if you ask for analytics, it's always going to find you analytics controller and never anything else.
But needs also validates up front. So an important thing if you do this .container lookup in your at runtime is you might have bugs where you just type in something in that, and they won't tell you what the object's instantiated. Whereas if you use needs does the same thing, this container lookup, except that when the controller gets instantiated, just make sure, hey, can all of these controllers even exist? If they don't, they'll error right there, which is often much nicer than having the at runtime failure.
Yeah. Yeah. Cool. So we're going to dive a little bit into Ember itself and see how like Ember uses these internals to hook itself together before we look at some application stuff. So Ember is going to find a template. So inside of Ember.view, it's extending this thing called core view, and there's a function template for name. Template for name does a couple things, but then you see on line 8, it finds a container. There's some old cruft at the side there for default container. None of that stuff really exists anymore. It's all deprecated. But basically, it just does a container lookup for template plus whatever the name of your template was, right? There's like no rocket science here. It's just looking in there. And we talked about before how the container had a resolver that's handling like finding all these things for you, so you don't need to register them. So Ember also has a default resolver, which will like actually find all the things that make up Ember itself. And this is the one that ends up getting run if you have a templates, and we can see that looks at ember.templates and pulls it out. And at the end of the day, this is just hooked onto the resolve call of the container, just like we did before. It's just like a better abstracted version of the same thing. So Ember can generate a controller. So it's going to try and figure out like, you're about to do this thing, and do you actually have this controller? You're going to the index of your app or something like that, and you're going to see if you have an index controller. So it tries to call controller 4, which will come back and say if it already exists, like if you have defined it, here it is, and if not, then it will just return nothing. And it will go and call like, I don't have this thing, so I'm going to generate one on the fly. And when we look at the generation code, you can see that it takes the context. So the context is your actual model, and it's going to do a little bit of analysis to say, is the model, what kind of thing is it? Is it going to be an object? Is it going to be an array? And if it is one of those things, it can be smart about the option and decide to use an array controller. And then we see on the factory on line 12 there, it comes up controller colon array controller colon object, and that's how it decides what kind of controller it's going to use. On line 14, it looks up that factory, it adds a couple things to it, and then it registers it explicitly back into its own container on line 23. So it's just like pre-prepping it. So it's kind of a complex use. But yeah, so that's how we actually find like that there is a controller in the system, just using the same like basic tools on the container as anything else. Another really good example, and I think a really good canonical example if you wanted to make a plugin of your own or even just things in your own application, is the way that Ember Data handles this stuff. So there's a Ember.onload, which is kind of like a plugin hook that you can do if you are going to build an Ember plugin of your own. And once you're in there, you have the application, you create an initializer, like we talked about before, and you can just say application inject. And this is how we have the store available on all controllers and on all routes and on all serializers, for instance. But we don't have it available on views in Ember, and that's because there's no line here that injects it onto everything of a view type. We don't have access to it on components because it's not injected onto things of the component type. And Ember Data has like a whole slew of these things that kind of are interdependent, and that's one of the things that makes it a really good example for how to handle like a really complex use case where you have to bootstrap a really complicated environment for yourself. Okay, so we're going to talk how to reorganize some things and how to rejigger things when we want to like use them in a different way than what Ember has as its normal patterns and strict separations. So the first one we're going to do is make an li tag active for subroutes. So if any of you guys have used Bootstrap before and tried to use Bootstrap with Ember, there's like this classic pain in the ass thing where you have a set of tabs, and the way that Bootstrap expects them to work is they'll all be li elements, and they'll have a class on them. And when they're active, the li will have a class of active, and when it's not active, it'll be nothing or something. And then inside of that li tag is the link that actually sends you from place to place. Super. But in Ember has this great feature where we can say on any link, if you're on that route, it'll have a class of active. Well, that works really well, but when you're dealing with these tabs, that doesn't understand subroutes very well. So there's a current when feature, but even then, you need this active class to be on the li and not on the a tag. So we can make a simple thing that will handle this for us. And this is very similar to what link view does in Ember itself when it's doing the active thing. On line 5, we're going to do what we talked about before and take the this.container and pull up the router. I'm just going to make it a property. And then on line 9, we're going to define in isActive. It's going to look at current when, which can be passed in. And then it's going to decide what's going on. And if I open this up, and this is it here. So I'm on my index right now, and this is the little active li current when index over here. It's a link to index. So if I just go there, I'm already on index. This other one is a link to person, and this is the actual link. And then around it, we have the active li that's current when you're at people. So now I can go to person, and under person, I can go to this subroute here of people and be able to go back and forth in between these two subroute states. And I still have that active class that's on my li. And the active is only applied to the li. It's not looking at the a tag itself. So this is a really good example of how you needed the framework to legitimately understand some piece of state about the router at a component level, and we can kind of bend the rules to make that happen as long as we don't totally smash through any boundaries. So we can then go ahead and test the same thing, and this is kind of a good opportunity to make a container and then have it do something special. So normally in Ember, you have a component, so you think you need the whole app because you need it to have all these other relations. In this case, we need it to have a router in order to be able to actually understand if it's going to be active. So on line 5, or on line 4, I'm going to make a brand new container, and I'm leaking the container out of the scope. The scope is defined on line 1. There's all those variables that say these are going to pop out of scope. So on line 4, I make a brand new one. On line 5, we register the component itself. So it's app.activeLi component. So I register that into my container. And then on line 6, I'm going to register router:main. So I'm just going to make up a router on the fly. I'm going to stub out the router. And I give it a URL, and I give it a function called isActive, which does nothing. And in this case, I called Ember object create on line 6. So I already have an object. So I'm going to tell it, don't even instantiate it, just return back the object that I've already given you. And then I'll just look them up again. And when I look them up, I'm pulling them back out of the container. And that's important, right? Because you have to pull the instance out of the container in order for it to have the this.container inside of it. You can't just call create on it on your own and have it made. And that will allow us to write some pretty nifty tests. So there's our setup. And now in these tests here, I can just go ahead and stub out the router, which again was leaked out of the scope, give it a function isActive, and just change. In this case, I want to see that the path and the current when are going to actually be the same. Down here, if I return false from the router, if the router says this is not an active route, then I want to make sure that the component also thinks that it's not active and that it is active, and on and on. Come on. Yeah. OK, so we're going to do another example is to create a service with needs. So we talked about needs before as being this great way to make really lightweight kind of architectural things on your app. So in this case, we're going to make an audio player. And we're going to look at this project called 2B, which I think we've showed a couple different times at various Ember meetups. But if I pull it up, I've got this Tomster, and he plays music. And when I click on him, he stops. When I click on him, he starts again. It's just this little toggle. Well, when you play audio in HTML5, you have to play the audio on the DOM somewhere. You have to actually have an audio tag that you can do with it. So you don't want to create just a shitload of audio tags. That seems kind of silly. So you really just want one tag that's rendered in one spot on the app, and then you want to be able to talk to the controller for it and say, hey, I have a new track for you. I have something new for you to play, or something like that. And that's basically what we end up doing. We have on the side over there, the template, and the template says render audio player, and at some high level, like away from the rest of the application code, and then render the outlet and application handlebars. The audio player controller on line 1 is the thing that's obviously attached to that, and it has a function called play. On line 10, we say I want to pull in the audio player. On line 11, we just alias it so that's nice and convenient. And then on line 16, we're able to call player.play and actually tell it to like do things. So we basically created this really lightweight ad hoc service to be able to play tunes from anywhere in our application, from any controller in the app. And again, this makes it really easy to go ahead and test. So we can go ahead and register like they're called field elements in Ember, those things like the big Tomster. So we can register the field element controller, and we can register like an object for the audio player, and then I can go ahead and check that every time some action gets fired, every time the start action gets fired on the field element controller, that the audio player itself is a thing that actually receives the play function and like what kind of arguments it gets from it. So we have this really good way to like mock out our service at the same time. Okay, so now we're going to do the more fun thing, and we're going to make brand new types entirely. So all of those other examples were like how to get different parts of Ember to talk to each other, and now we're just going to go ahead and take like whole new things and add them into the stack because they don't quite fit into the into what's been suggested. So the first thing is a deferred queued uploader. So Tubi has this crazy thing where there's this box up on the top right, which is pretty small, but this is like a visualizer of our deferred queue. So I'm going to go ahead and draw. And as I draw, I add things to this queue, and you can see the queue is like not flushing as I draw. And if I start drawing just over in this corner, the other things will flush out of the queue, but this one will stay in the queue because it knows that I'm active and it doesn't want to try and save it while I'm still doing things. And if I go over here, that one will go ahead and flush, and then this one will be stuck in the queue until I stop doing it. So it manages like a lot of things, right? It manages all these different events that are going into it, saying that someone's painted or someone's moved something around, the properties have changed. It's uploading to Google Cloud on the fly, and then like taking that URL and pushing it back to the own server. So it's got like a lot of intricate things that didn't fit well into any other data store. So we register it on. We give options for type, which is just another way to say like the options at the end. We could have probably just collapsed that into the next line. We register this thing of the field element updater, and then we go ahead and inject it onto all controllers, models, and routes. So now, just like the store in Ember, we have a thing that's available like kind of through a lot of the parts of our application where it's appropriate. And then on line 14, we even have some like legacy code, which is not in Ember, and we sometimes need to be able to hit this updater from inside of the legacy code. So in that case, we just look it up on the container. So we take that instance, and then we go ahead and throw it in on the application. So now at app.fieldElementUpdater, we have access to that singleton. And because it's a singleton, every time we look it up, it's always going to be the same thing over and over again. So we know that we always have the same one. Another really fun one to do is authentication. And I've been playing with containers with this a lot, and I think we're getting to something really neat. In an earlier version was this project Grim Visage, which we did as a run through at one of the hacker hours, actually. Grim Visage. I think I left it running. Cool. So in Grim Visage, we have like some authentication. I'm going to go ahead and sign in. And I think I'm going to just make a new account, which is going to be moo@moo.com. And howdy, and submit. And this is like a demo project, and it's all using Firebase. Oh, whoops, not the right password. Cool. And then I'm signed in. And once I'm signed in, like it uses the camera on the thing, and you can take this photo. And now anyone can go to this URL and like get that photo. And because it's Firebase, one of the neat, like odd, quirky things is that if any of you were to pull down this code and run it on your own computer and go to that same URL, because it's the ID 28, you would see the same exact image that I just posted, even though it's running on your own computer, which is kind of cool. But this thing has a bunch of authentication, right? So it has like sign in, a sign up, and all these other things. So it has to deal with the state of authentication. Uh-oh. Uh-oh. Am I losing Keynote? There we go. And so what we do for this is only a couple layers deep. The first thing at the top there is that this was before the Firebase bindings came out, so it's all done from scratch. So it has a custom Firebase adapter. So we're going to take that adapter, just like we would have a store in Ember data, and we're going to inject that onto all controllers and onto all routes. So now any controller or route has access to a thing called Firebase, which is on line 8 and 9 there, the name of the thing. And it's the factory of adapter : Firebase, which is defined on line 7 as that singleton. So there's this instance of Firebase adapter sitting around that you can always go ahead and like send messages to and be able to call things on. And then the authentication itself further down is going to take something from the controllers directory. This is a little bit of AppKit on line 16, a little bit of ES6 modules. It's going to take that factory and register it into a thing called session. So I'm going to make a brand new kind of thing called session. This is going to be the main session. And it's going to be, again, another singleton. I want to inject it onto all controllers and routes. So now my controllers and routes have access to a thing called Firebase. They also have access to a thing called session. And then on the line below that, I'm going to take the session adapter, which is going to be an adapter for Firebase authentication. And I want to take that and inject it into the session as the adapter. So this is a little bit loopy. The idea is that it allows us to define multiple kinds of authentication. So if we wanted to authenticate with something besides Firebase, like OAuth 2 or something like that, we can drop in a different authentication layer. And what it lets our code do for the session controllers look really super simple. Because we've injected from the outside what the adapter is just going to be this Firebase auth. All I need to worry about in this session controller is the state for the session. The adapter itself can take care of all of the actual authentication or Firebase-y stuff, and this just maintains my state of like, am I actually authenticated right now? Do I have a current user? Who is my current user? And those various questions. So it lets us create a really nice separation of our various tiers. And so the containers allow like you to define patterns beyond the MVC. So you can definitely do bad things with them, but I think that they're an amazingly powerful tool for building really complicated apps and being able to do kind of unique things that break the mold a little bit. And then the resolver and container are powering a lot of things that are coming in Ember. Changes around how it uses modules both internally and probably externally in different projects. And so this kind of stuff is nice to at least have in the back of your head, even if you don't end up using it on a day-to-day basis, because it's going to impact our worlds like, I don't know, in a year or something like that. Like it'll be a change that you can't kind of hide from anymore. So it's definitely good to be thinking about this stuff. And that's pretty much it. Any,
Questions for Matthew? I'm going to run the mic back to you.
Besides a logger, what else have you found to be useful in injecting in controllers of your app?
I'm sorry, besides the?
Besides a logger.
Besides the logger, what kind of things have we used it for? Super common is metrics. Pretty much every app, when we need to spin up a thing to do like Google Analytics tracking or mixed panel tracking or like any of those other services, we just like throw together a standalone controller or standalone singleton of something that's responsible for managing all of that stuff as a point of abstraction. Any third-party API that you can put behind some kind of just like service object that's Emberfied is really beneficial, because then you can stop leaking all of that other code into your app, and you can start having actual bindings that go back and forth to things, and it becomes really, really powerful.
Question back here?
Yeah. In your previous example of workers and jobs, what would the resolver do in a scenario you have too many workers, not enough jobs, or too many jobs, not enough workers, or some cases one worker is forced to do multiple jobs? How would the resolver handle that?
Yeah, I think in this case I just left that off as an implementation detail of like however the worker pool is going to work.
Previous example.
The worker pool itself, like in JavaScript normally, is kind of silly because everything in like you're dealing with a synchronous process in JavaScript, so it's kind of silly to like break it up into these chunks. For us, it provided a nice abstraction point to be able to try and use web workers. But yeah, we had to deal with like a limit of, okay, now I have my 3, so these other things need to sit in a queue, and then eventually I'll like retry them and be able to do something else. But yeah, it's just an implementation detail, I think.
Cool. Any other questions for Matthew?
So using __ container is really dangerous and bad, but this container returns basically the same thing, doesn't it? So what's the huge difference between them that makes one good and one bad?
Yeah, app __ container is not. So like this container is always going to be there on a thing that is instantiated. So it's always going to be like present in a scope which is valid. So if you're testing this thing, you expect that it's going to come out of a container, so it's always going to be there. App __ container is like not necessarily guaranteed. You have to wait for the app to actually boot up for it to be present. It's also just like an API that could. You're right that it shares the same API as this .container. In that API, if it changes, you'll have the same impact upon you if your inside instance is there. It has underscores for a reason. We can try and find out more reasons for why it has them. But I mean, I think I agree that it's a smell. It's a global.
Tom Dale threatened to add more underscores if we use it in our app.
Yeah. It's not global though, because it is actually only there when the object has come out of the container. So the container was in control of like, you have access to me, whereas when you're accessing app __ container from an object, you're basically saying like, I deem the container to exist now, which is not a truth. It's like the dependency of the container has been injected onto you when you're using this .container. The control is on the container side.
If you're using the container, it is likely a place where there's a deficiency in the Ember API. So rather than hiding the container and making everyone just deal with the fact that we might be missing API, it's exposed. But the idea being, if you're using it repeatedly, it's basically a deficiency. So if you have repeated use, report it as a bug. That is like a genuine thing that we want to see. We want to see the use cases so that we can make it so you don't use it.
I was also going to say just before the whole container API, there was this like 2 years ago or a year and a half ago or whatever it was, the way that you were encouraged to build Ember apps was to basically have your app object and then you'd say app like lower score whatever controller equals controller.create. Like you were creating instances of controllers just globally stashed onto this app object. And as we sort of introduced this container API, people were just like, oh, I guess this is like the new weirdly roundabout way of like stashing stuff on the global app object. So I'm going to like use this container thing, and the whole like prefixing with underscores would be like, no, don't do this. This is really bad. It's really, really bad. I swear. Use like the new way of doing things. So that's sort of another reason that it's that way. If there's some reasons that you can't get around Ember's API that you like really need to use __ container, fine, and like help us find a better way to build it. But it's definitely there to like, help everyone at the time to like definitely make the transition into this sort of new way of working with stuff.
Also use the inspector to, like, if you're using it for debugging, anything you can do with __ container, you can probably do much better from the inspector. And the inspector API won't change, but the container one may. So.
You mentioned that this container is injected when it's retrieved from the container, so it's not actually on there until it's actually retrieved. So if you create an object and stash it on the container, you won't be able to reference this container inside that object until it's explicitly retrieved from the container?
Right, so if you're using like a traditional Ember app where your view is app.indexView, if you just take app.indexView.create, that will not have a container on it. It doesn't know about the container, it doesn't know where to find it, there is no global. Instead, you have to send it through a container in order to get access to it.
So even when you stash it, it doesn't get added. It's only when you retrieve it.
It's only when you retrieve it, true. Yeah, the dependencies, because you can add multiple dependencies, they're all like lazy. They all wait until the last possible minute to actually inject themselves onto things.
It's also only when it's instantiated by the container. Right. So if you stash it and you make it instantiate false, it also.
So this is going to be a great topic of continued conversation at the bar for folks who are interested.
Yeah, I'll put them up shortly. Yeah, there's links
somebody have dropped a Moleskine. It has a Cyrus Innovation logo on the front. Does anybody know who this might belong to? Okay, if anybody does know, I'm going to leave it at Pivotal for Lost and Found. I have one more trivia question for anybody who wants to earn the last CodeSchool membership, and it's related to the talk that we just had. So there's two strategies for using the container, as we just heard from Matthew. One of them is the kind of the dependency injection strategy, where you register an injection saying dot inject, and the other is the kind of service locator when you'd call dot lookup. Which of those creates more coupling in your application? Lookup, indeed. The way to think about that is, imagine you're trying to write a test of something that uses lookup. You have to have something that is a container for that test in order for that to be able to call lookup on something. Congrats on 1 month of code school. Cool, so for you folks, you're probably in one of two states right now. You're either exhausted from brain overload of all the information tonight from our awesome speakers, or you're so incredibly jazzed by this influx of Ember that you just want to keep going. And if you're in that latter category, we're going to go out for drinks at Lily's, which is 3 cold blocks away from here. And I'm putting up a map up on the screen. It's at 13 East 17th. So just east of 5th Avenue on 17th Street. Thank you all for coming out. Thank you for our awesome speakers, to Steph, Alex, Brendan, Sarah, and Matthew. We really appreciate it, and we will see you all next month or at Hacker Hours. Thanks, everybody.